Afghanistan's top security chiefs could lose their jobs. After a wave of deadly attacks in Kabul, there are growing calls to oust the officials responsible for keeping the peace. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Afghanistan's security. A wave of attacks in Afghanistan has added to growing skepticism over whether the government can keep its people safe. Last month, more than 250 people died during a Taliban attack on a military base. Then, a massive truck bomb exploded in Kabul last week. And on Tuesday, another suicide bombing, this time in the city of Herat. Afghanistan's Foreign Minister Salahuddin Rabbani has called for the country's top security chiefs to be fired. But is that enough, given the Afghan defense minister and army chief already resigned in April? We'll debate that in just a moment, but first, Shoaib Hassan looks back at the deadly attacks that are further shaking an already unstable nation.
This is the latest scene of bloodshed in Afghanistan after a series of blasts in just 10 days. The attacks have killed more than 170 Afghans. Protesters have now come onto the streets demanding government accountability.
We want the Afghan President and Chief Executive Officer Abdullah to resign, because in the past 3 years they have been unable to govern the country. They and the government are incompetent.
But Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has brushed aside such criticism and echoed the claims of his NDS intelligence service. They blamed the militant Haqqani network and said that neighboring Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency had provided support. Pakistan's denied the allegations.
The accusatory approach is unhelpful towards efforts for peace.
But it's not the Haqqani network, but another, newer group that's claimed responsibility for the latest bombing, Daesh in Afghanistan. Daesh's roots have connections to Afghanistan. Both Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the founder of Daesh's precursor Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and Daesh's current leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi are said to have fought in campaigns here during the 90s civil war. It was under the aegis of a group called the Islamic State of Kunar, which also controlled the surrounding regions including Nangarhar, Nuristan and Laghman. The Taliban eventually captured the areas during their campaign in the 90s. But experts say the group still enjoys strong support here and is closer in ideology to Daesh than the Taliban. And the US military agrees. That's why it's used the only bomb smaller than a nuclear device in its arsenal to target the region. The Moab, nicknamed the mother of all bombs, hit a Daesh mountain stronghold in Nangarhar. But the Afghan military says it's not enough.
To avoid insurgents' return, we have to have bases in the area, but we lack soldiers. We carry out operations and push the insurgents to the mountains. But later, I have to take my forces to other places for operations. And as soon as we abandon the area, insurgents return.
It's a classic picture of the decades-long fight here. The international coalition declares a success after pummeling militant bases from the air, only for them to strike back in the cities with ordinary citizens paying the ultimate price. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Joining me now to discuss this further is Omar Samad in Vancouver. He is a former advisor to the Afghan government. In Washington, D.C., Mued Yusuf, Associate Director at the United States Institute of Peace, and from Kabul, Javid Faisal. He is the spokesman for the Chief Executive of Afghanistan. He also survived last week's truck bombing in Kabul. Thanks so much for joining us all. Javid, glad you are here. Let me begin with this. I want to talk about the strategy of the government so far to try and fight terrorism in the country. First of all, is firing top security officials part of a winning strategy, do you think, or might there be a problem actually finding even more competent people to replace those who may be fired and who've already resigned? Omar, let me begin with you.
Well, I think that what is very important is to prioritize according to the needs of the day. And that means that we need to find out, first of all, why the incidents occurred, how they occurred, who may be behind it, since nobody has taken responsibility, but all the hallmarks show that it may have been a Haqqani network attack that took the lives of more than 100 Afghans last week. And then the other two shootings and incidents that took place where demonstrators were killed on the streets, as well as the other bombing during the funeral. So we need to get the forensics correct, and we need to investigate, and then we need to look at who should stay and who should go.
Okay, Mued, are you on the same page there? Is it first about assessing responsibility clearly?
Well, look, I mean, I think attribution is crucial. There is no question about that. But in terms of firing security officials, that's never the solution to any problem. But sometimes it becomes politically necessary. I mean, you've seen the kind of reaction, very legitimate, justified reaction from the people of Afghanistan with protests against the government. But it was really anger at the inability to prevent what happened. And for that, I think the president was, it was necessary to give a political statement. And that political statement, unfortunately, sometimes involves sacking people. But that in itself is not going to remove the problem here. And I suspect, unfortunately, that we haven't seen the last of this kind of violence in Afghanistan. So it's crucial to understand the attribution, but also crucial then to address that problem through security measures that will prevent something like this from happening again.
Okay, Javid, go ahead.
I don't think termination of responsible authorities is the solution to the problem, especially not at a moment when we still have to wait the completion of investigations of the incidents we have had in the past couple of days. But if it could be a solution, we are okay with that, but after the completion of the investigations. Permanently, we have been seeking solutions to the problem, and that's the peace talks with the groups who are fighting in Afghanistan, at the same time to work to attract attention in support of the states who are currently seemingly to be sponsoring terrorism. That's a better option for us, and we will have to be working towards that to make sure that the countries in the region are supporting the legal cause, which is peace for Afghanistan.
I'd like to talk about that further in a second, Javid, because there is an issue the Afghan government has said time and time again with what they feel is Pakistan interfering and doing very little, in fact, sometimes even promoting, they think, terrorism in Afghanistan. But you also address the issue of peace talks. And right now, officials are actually hosting a dialogue on peace and security called the Kabul process. But it seems the public doesn't believe the talks will actually work. Now, the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies actually published a report. And that says, we have a graphic here, more than 70% of respondents believe government talks with the Taliban have failed. Only 21% found them to be even partly successful. 68% believe the government has also failed at bringing armed opposition groups into the peace process. And then 48% believe that Pakistan benefits from Afghanistan's instability. Omar Samad, let me begin with you on this question then. First of all, why don't the Afghan people have confidence in these peace talks?
Well, listen, the Taliban have been around for 20 years. And since 9/11, when they were ousted from power from Kabul, they went back to their safe havens outside of Afghanistan. And after a couple of years of reorganization, came back and tried to destabilize Afghanistan and make problems for the new Afghan government, which is a constitutional government and has been elected by the Afghan people. So we have a question of legitimacy here. And I think that the Afghan people realize that the Taliban claims and the Taliban actions are not legitimate, and they do not make sense. And all they do is use violence against the Afghan people, against Afghan forces, and they destroy their country. So if Taliban claim to be Afghans, then obviously the Afghan people, regardless of their ethnicity, region, or creed, have some expectations. And some of those expectations have to do with coming to terms politically with other Afghans, laying down their arms and stopping the killing and the destruction.
Muad, I'd like you to pick up on that, if you can, in respect to how the U.S. as well feels now, at least, that engaging the Taliban does not work toward peace, that the Taliban cannot be part of a political solution, as was said by the Ministry of Defense in the U.S. Do you think there's space for the Taliban in dialogue here, or will engaging extremism ultimately derail peace talks?
Look, I think there are 2 or 3 things to note. First of all, there has been no peace process to speak of. So when we talk about that talks have not delivered, talks have not happened in that sense. So we'll have to wait and see on that. As far as the US view is concerned, it's very difficult to say. With the current environment in Washington, there is an Afghanistan policy review that's going on that was supposed to be completed last month but has been delayed. And there are still conversations. There's not a consensus in Washington on what the next US strategy or the next US move is going to be. I think what is clear, and I think where Omar is absolutely right, that the Taliban have been waging this war and the Afghan people are fed up of it. The problem, of course, is that there isn't a military solution that seems to be in sight. If you could defeat the insurgency completely, there won't be a question of peace talks in that sense. But right now, I think the only point of consensus in Washington is that there is no purely military solution to this problem. So if there isn't a purely military solution, you've got to think of the political one. And the political one involves peace talks necessarily. So one way or another, you'll have to create an architecture which allows those peace talks to go forward, but comes to a deal where the Afghan constitution remains upheld even if the Taliban are brought back in. The military solution part, I think there's nobody in Washington who believes that that's a real possibility.
So Javed, let me ask you, if you also think peace talks are part of the answer here, why does the Afghan public seem to have no confidence in dialogue?
Let me just correct one thing here. We do have a peace process, and we have a very successful peace process. The peace accord with Hizb Islami was one of the examples that how successful could an Afghan-led and owned peace process be. The problem with the Taliban is that we don't have any outcome from the talks with the Taliban is that they are owned by some others. They no longer have one leadership, they no longer have one group. They are divided into groups and different leaderships, and they are being manipulated and controlled and trained by others outside Afghanistan. This is the main problem, and this is the reason we were holding the Kabul process meeting yesterday in Kabul to make sure that the countries who could be effective in bringing Taliban to peace talks are coming into a consensus, are coming into an agreement that they will have to be supporting the peace process. But I agree to the word that the political solution is the only way out of this problem. We believe that militarily a solution is not as good a solution as a political one could be for the Afghans. But there is a peace process.
And we also heard in that public survey there, though, as you alluded to earlier, Javed, that there is an issue with many believing Pakistan is interfering in Afghan affairs and actually furthering the acts of terrorism in the country. Do you believe Pakistan is a destabilizing force, or is it serving as a sort of scapegoat for the government right now?
We have been hoping that Pakistan could become a good neighbor to Afghanistan and that someday they will stop using terrorism as a tool to achieve their foreign policy objectives. But the problem is that there is still faith on supporting terrorism. It has to change. The Taliban, who are killing innocent Afghans on a daily basis, are still having safe havens. They are still enjoying hospitality by the Pakistani establishment. They have well-established councils in Shoras, in Quetta, and in Peshawar. And there are thousands of madrasas who are providing fighting force to the fight in Afghanistan. This has to change, and we have been trying to work with Pakistan since the establishment of the unity government in the past 2.5 years. We have tried many times with Pakistan, and before that, during former President Karzai's time, we had worked with Pakistan, but we had no result. This time we are working to make sure that the region in the world are echoing in our supporting our cause for peace, and that they can invest on Pakistan or encourage Pakistan to be supportive of the Afghan people and government and not of the terrorist groups who are fighting against us.
Omar, do you believe Pakistan is the real problem here, or is it being used as a sort of scapegoat for the government in power now?
If you look at a hierarchy of reasons and for problems that exist and challenges that exist, I think Pakistan is up there at the top. For Afghans who have dealt with the situation for 2 decades, I think that there was an expectation that the Pakistanis would eventually come to realize that this is not serving anybody's interest, including their own, and that to make use of non-state actors like the Taliban is not going to make a difference in the view of the Afghan people, and that they cannot impose such a force on the Afghans. Now, having said this, the Taliban feel emboldened. So the discussion in Washington and other places is, what should we do to break this sense of invisibility? And I think that the Taliban are the ones who think that they can win this militarily, or at least push the envelope so far that they can have a very strong hands eventually if one day they sit at the table. I think that that is also a mistaken view from the Taliban and those who provide them strategic advice. I think that this is not going to happen. They are facing overwhelming disenchantment from the Afghan people towards them and their policies and their agenda. Yes, there are problems inside Afghanistan. There are governance problems. There's a problem with justice or injustice. There's a problem with a lot of issues that are internal to Afghanistan. But when it comes to a problem that has been imposed on Afghanistan, an undeclared war, as the Afghan leaders call it, then I think that it falls on Pakistan to deliver and to make changes in its policy.
Okay, Mued, let me ask if you're on the same page there. And do you think corruption within its own ranks in the Afghan government is being taken seriously enough as well as part of the problem?
Look, you know, whenever you're in these kind of situations where there's mega violence in the face, insurgents, counter-insurgents not being able to break the stalemate, you'll always have this finger-pointing, this blame game, both sides believing that they could come to a position of strength and then negotiate, and that's what keeps wars going. And I think Afghanistan is a good example. I think all of these are problems, right? The region is a problem. Pakistan's interfered in Afghanistan for decades. Corruption, internal political failures, internal economic failures, they're all parts of the reason why the Afghan people do not feel confident either about the state of Afghanistan's sort of government or the security situation. On the Pakistan part, I mean, I agree with both the guests that there is a Pakistan problem which needs to be resolved. There is a regional problem in general, but I don't think it's enough to say Pakistan has to deliver. The question is, Pakistan hasn't delivered from the Afghanistan perspective, or from the Pakistani perspective, maybe Afghanistan hasn't delivered. The only way this cannot be resolved is if Afghanistan and Pakistan stop talking to each other, point fingers at each other, or do not have a conversation on how to move forward. I completely understand the frustration that this has happened millions of times. It hasn't resulted in anything good, but at the end of the day, I also haven't found anybody who can give me a solution to Afghanistan's problem which can come without Afghanistan and its neighbors finding a regional consensus. And right now, I think the Afghanistan-Pakistan relationship is probably the worst I've ever seen it in recent decades. And that, I think, is the fundamental issue. Somehow, whether the US gets them back on the same page or others, but these two sides have to talk, have to figure out a way to coordinate on this security front. Otherwise, I think Afghanistan, the situation will not improve, but Pakistan also loses out big time if Afghanistan remains turbulent.
Okay. Javed, I will give you a very quick final word.
Thank you. Just on the part of Pakistan, we have tried our best to take measures to build trust with Pakistan. We have done on our part, like 2 years ago, we even sent our soldiers for training to Pakistan, but Pakistan unfortunately did not deliver on the promises they made to us in their meetings. The military and their civil establishment did not deliver. Plus, now it's too hard, too difficult to work with a partner who is not trustworthy. But we still are looking forward to working with Pakistan to making sure that the two countries can live in peace and that the peace can return to the region.
Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I would like to thank all three of you so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still to come, Britain's Prime Minister is campaigning on a security platform, but can she keep her country safe? And power grab or government reform? Venezuela's president wants to change his country's constitution. Well, British Prime Minister Theresa May has made security a cornerstone of her campaign heading into Thursday's snap election. She has a record to run on with 2 terror attacks occurring in the past month. But her critics say her plan to prevent further attacks is too vague and in some cases discriminatory. And while May's rise to power centers on Brexit and kicking immigrants out of the country, she's facing a possible refugee crisis. France's President Emmanuel Macron wants to put a border agreement that currently keeps thousands of refugees off British soil up for review. So will May's detractors have an effect on Thursday's vote? That debate in just a moment, but first, Randolph Nogle is in the UK for us with this special report.
A second terror attack in the UK within a month, and in the middle of a general election campaign. On Saturday, 7 were killed when 3 men ran over pedestrians on London Bridge. They then got out of their van and started stabbing people. It's put the issue of security in this election front and center.
We believe we are experiencing a new trend in the threat we face. There is, to be frank, far too much tolerance of extremism in our country. But it is time to say enough is enough.
After what happened here on London Bridge just a few nights ago, Theresa May made her case for stronger security measures to stop the rise in attacks. But some worry her proposals could lead to more discrimination against Muslims. One includes criminalizing nonviolent extremism, a vague charge that not only raises questions about freedom of speech, but where the state will draw the line in surveilling its own citizens.
Also under consideration is a measure that would allow a terror suspect to be detained without charge. Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn's approach to the problem has not been to crack down, but rather to reach out to youth in underserved communities, saying they are at the greatest risk of turning to criminal behavior. Nimco is a candidate for the Women's Equality Party. She came to Britain as a child refugee from Somalia. She doesn't think either major party is effectively addressing what she sees as the root causes of terrorism.
I live in London, where in the last 6 weeks 18 young people have died. You're not looking at the fact that when young boys are being radicalized, it's because they don't find anywhere in this world, in this country that speaks to them. And you should be doing more about that as opposed to just talking down and talking at us.
She says she's pushing back against a right-wing campaign of fear and manipulation that blames immigrants for everything from violence to loss of jobs.
So the Brexit campaign was very painful to watch. Everything that I stood for, everything that makes this country amazing was something that people were meant to fear. So my gender, my race, my ethnic background, my faith. And it's my role and it's my responsibility as a citizen to go out there and say, actually, I'm a young black former child refugee. I'm great, I love this country, and we can really get together in order to make things better for everybody else, rather than assuming me as though I'm taking something away from this country. I'm adding to it.
In the port town of Dover, there was a 2/3 majority to leave the EU. Among some, there's nostalgia for better times of old.
You know, let's put the great back into Britain, you know.
Neil Ricks, Dover's mayor, says he thinks Brexit is key to doing just that.
You know, there's a lot of concerns, obviously, about immigration. I'd like to see it heavily regulated, definitely, and watch who comes in and watch who goes out. You know, I mean, and if they go out, then what reasons have they gone out for? With issues what's happened over the weekend again, they're going to keep happening.
Take back your borders, a provocative message to voters used during the Brexit campaign. Now some in France are calling on Britain to do just that and to renegotiate a critical treaty which has kept tens of thousands of refugees and migrants on the French side of the border.
Newly elected French President Emmanuel Macron has said he wants to review the Le Touquet deal, which allows France and Britain to set up border controls on the other's sovereign territory.
You know, before when we had our own borders here and we controlled our own borders, we never had refugee camps then, so why should we have them now?
But the question for many here is what party and what leader will best get them out of the Union, which they see as the source of many of the country's problems. Randolph Nogle, the Newsmakers in Dover.
And I'm joined now by Robin Simcox from Washington, D.C. He is a terrorism and national security analyst at the Heritage Foundation. And from Zurich, Paul Knott. He is the author of The Accidental Diplomat and foreign editor at the New European newspaper. Thanks both so much for joining us. Let me just ask this question point blank. Given the increase in terrorist attacks over the past months, would you say the UK government has failed to protect its people? Let me start in Zurich.
I think there are questions to be asked. There are always questions to be asked after an awful period like the last few weeks in Britain with several deadly attacks about whether the police, the security services have the right level of resources and have been given the right level of resources. So those are genuine questions that we need to look into.
And Robin, your take?
Yes, well, I think you'd have to say that over a longer period, the UK government hasn't done a terribly good job at controlling migration flows. Obviously, there is two components to this. You have the terrorist threat that comes from foreign nationals, but you also have British citizens that carry out these kind of attacks. And so the government has tried to make some headway, and this isn't just the Conservative government, but the Labour government before it, in trying to deport foreign national terror suspects, but it's not always had the legal ability to be able to do so. So there are constraints to what the government can do, and I think that has really hindered some of the counter-terrorism efforts over the past few years.
But Robin, then do you see the core of the problem being the presence of foreign nationals?
Well, it's a component of the problem. I think of especially in a period like the 1990s, where the UK took in lots of Islamist preachers fleeing authoritarian regimes, such as in Libya or Algeria or Egypt or Jordan, and they claimed refugee status in the UK, but they also went on to become some of the most high-profile leading Islamist preachers in the UK, who were very responsible for laying radical networks in the 1990s, kind of bringing the Islamist ideology into the mainstream within Muslim communities. And I do think that there has been clearly a problem with foreign clerics coming into the UK, foreign terror suspects, who the UK hasn't found it very easy to be able to deal with.
Well, I want to get your response to that. I mean, is it an issue of having allowed foreign nationals to come in, claim asylum, and then allow them to foment these extremist ideas and therefore act on them? Or is there a real just failure in security here?
No, I think no one would argue that any free society or any society actually has to be always vigilant about the people coming in, and nobody's saying it should be just open door and we shouldn't check people like that. But I'm very wary of tarring entire communities or all of the many people, immigrants or people of immigrant background, with the people responsible for these actions. And I think it's a dangerous road to take individual responsibility away from the truly nasty people who had committed these acts and incited these acts. So I think relating it to a very different issue of immigration is a dangerous road to go down, and not one that helps us to solve the problem. It needs to be about, as has been and continues to be, about identifying the people responsible and hitting them with the full force of the law.
Okay.
And
well, let me ask Robin, though, because some Britons do very much agree with you that immigration is the core problem here, and they voted along those lines. What do you think then the consequences will be now if France actually changes border agreements, as it is now said it will review, and more immigrants cross from camps like Calais from France into the UK?
Well, so I think that the UK immigration concerns don't all necessarily revolve around security. Immigration as an issue has polled as very consistently has been an area of concern for the UK, but that's not necessarily to do always with the national security imperatives. It's also partially to do with strain on social services, healthcare and schooling and housing and things like that. So in terms of the Calais situation, again, this is just one of those subjects that comes up quite perennially in the UK, and obviously there's a French component to this as well. I don't really know if this is going to get resolved. I see no special evidence that it will be resolved now any more than it was 10 years ago. And as for the idea of borders coming back up, I do feel as if there's a lot of obviously commitment to the European Union ideal, countries like France and Germany, but obviously we've seen cases in the last couple of years of terrorists being able to take advantage of the borderless parts of mainland Europe. So there are security imperatives there. How France responds to that is going to be a matter for the French government, but it is worth stating that France has been under a state of emergency now for over 18 months, and it's no surprise it's beginning to look at every option.
Okay. Well, let me ask you, because Prime Minister Theresa May has said that criminalizing what she called nonviolent extremism should be part of fighting terrorism in the United Kingdom. First of all, what do you think that means exactly? And do you think it would be effective?
Yeah, I think you just have to be very careful about not affecting people who are not involved in any kind of violence. But we already have laws that are related to incitement to violence, for example. We already have anti-terrorist laws, and so we have actually the security forces have succeeded in foiling plots and locking up people responsible for them, and including people in planning or stirring up extremism and hatred and encouraging others to commit violence. So we would need to see what exactly she proposes. There's not a lot of detail there, I think, in what she's said already. But I think we should bear in mind the thing we're trying to defend here is a free society, and that encourages things like free speech, up to a very high degree, and that we already have laws and systems in place to deal with much of this kind of thing. The issue is more making sure we catch people.
Okay, Robin, as we do, there are incitement laws on the books already. There are hate speech laws on the books already. Do you think they go far enough, though? I mean, why can't extremist speech, nonviolent extremist speech, equate to the outlawed hate speech that's no longer protected under freedom of speech?
Well, I don't think I don't think what we need here is more laws. The problem is that nonviolent extremism is I think is a problem in the UK, and I would give some examples. The sentiments that express, for example, on crime and on criminal offences, and nor should they be. But there is a broader problem, I think, with extremism. I would give an example from the Charlie Hebdo attacks back in January 2015. The polling in the UK after of British Muslim opinion on that was that a quarter had sympathy for the Charlie Hebdo attackers who carried out this massacre, essentially imposing blasphemy law. So is it a crime to believe that blasphemy law should be brought back in? No, certainly not, and nor should it become a crime. Is it a problem that, for example, that a quarter of people polled thought that? I think that is a problem. So I don't know if it's something you can fix. Well, it's not something you can fix with laws, but it's certainly a societal issue that we should be concerned by.
Okay, and some, well, let me ask you this, including Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party, have pushed the idea that the better approach to address those that they see at risk of turning to criminal or extremist behavior is better integration policy. And they think really finding an extremist ideology only comes second to core criminal vulnerability, that you have to catch them earlier on before those extremist tendencies become a real problem. Do you think there's a solution in that there, or is it a bit too vague?
No, I think there's whether it's, I don't think it's a complete solution, but it's certainly something we should be doing. And to be fair to the government, they have been pursuing programs along that line to some extent. But I think, yeah, you see the pattern certainly with ISIS activists in Britain and Europe, where they remarkably often they're young men with sort of vaguely criminal or kind of backgrounds, have been involved in gang violence before, and then have actually come to Islamism, extremist Islamism, quite late in the day. It's not, not that they've been a regular part of sort of mainstream Islamist Islamic organizations, anything like that. So there's definitely, definitely it's possibly the ultimate example of where prevention would be the very best thing of all if it can be achieved. And it is a long-term process of community organizations, of trying, of picking out people who are at risk and taking steps to guide them away from getting involved with such organizations and activities.
Okay, very quick final words, Robin.
Well, yes, I just think that I hope that as the government begins to respond to this, there's always a temptation for the government to reach out to what it thinks it's the most representative Muslim groups. Often they tend to be just the most organized rather than the most representative. And I wouldn't, for example, as someone who's raised as a broadly Christian background, wouldn't expect the government to engage with me purely through the local vicar. So I think there's always a temptation for the government to address these issues on religious terms. And to do so is, I think, probably not the path we want to go down.
Okay, Robin, I'll let you have the last word. I'd like to thank you both, Robin and Noel, so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
I shall propose it explicitly. The new constitution will go to a consultative referendum, so it is the people who will say whether they are in agreement or not with the new strengthened constitution.
Venezuela, once one of Latin America's most prosperous countries, is facing a deep social and economic crisis. Falling oil prices, financial mismanagement, and corruption have all taken their toll on a country that's operating under a new reality. Months of violence on the streets have left more than 60 people dead, thousands more injured. Pitched battles with riot police have erupted throughout the country as many protesters demand President Nicolas Maduro step down. On Thursday, Maduro pledged to hold a referendum on a new constitution, a move that the opposition says is undemocratic and a blatant attempt to further entrench his power. Maduro, for his part, has called the opposition coup mongers backed by the United States. Well, my colleague Sandra Gatman spoke to one leading politician calling for Maduro's resignation.
Well, joining me now from Caracas is Maria Corina Machado. She's the leader of the opposition party, Vente Venezuela. Mrs. Machado, many thanks for joining us once again. You've been on this program before, and we spoke around the time the protests first began, more than 60 days ago, and yet we're still seeing thousands of people on the streets. Many have been killed, many hundreds have been injured, many thousands have been detained, and yet the calls for President Maduro to step down haven't cooled down. We've also heard President Maduro in the last several days promise to go ahead with this referendum to come up with a new constitution. Have your protests failed?
On the contrary, as you have said, every day that goes by, more and more Venezuelan people with the young students in the first line have come out because our fight is because of hunger in the streets and throughout our country. And not only hunger for food, but hunger for dignity, justice, and freedom. And certainly the results are huge. On first hand, we're seeing Maduro getting more and more isolated, not only in the international community, but locally. We have seen in the last days members of the Supreme Court that used to be absolutely loyal to the regime take a step aside and make distance with this initiative of the regime to go ahead with a change in the constitution. And second, we've seen the general prosecutor said, and yesterday she went to the Supreme Court, once again stating that this process that Maduro wants to establish with strength and using the strength of the regime is unconstitutional as well. So what we're seeing is that not only more and more citizens are determined to move ahead into a transition process to recover liberty and democracy in Venezuela, but also Maduro getting more and more isolated by his own forces.
Yet from the outside looking inwards, it appears that President Maduro holds all the cards. He's got the loyalty of the National Guard, of the military. He has all the resources of the state oil company. He's got the loyalty of many Supreme Court judges as well, and a loyal supporter base. Do you honestly believe that President Maduro will, at some point, voluntarily give up power?
Well, he'll realize he has no option, and that's exactly what's starting to happen. Yes, they used to have a lot of money until they ruined not only Venezuelan private sector, but also Venezuelan oil company. They used to have a lot of international support because they distributed Venezuelan money to gain loyalties, and now everybody in the democratic world realizes that it's not a good idea to be linked to a regime that has clear relationships with narco-trafficking and money laundering and so on. And now they used to have control of the streets through repression and fear. And believe me, what I'm seeing in Venezuelan streets throughout our country is that fear has been left behind. You are seeing young students, you are seeing their mother, you are seeing workers, people that come from all walks of life getting together and making the regime realize they have only one option. And it's a negotiation, a definitive negotiation to move ahead into a transition to democracy. And certainly what used to be the regime's main support, which is the armed forces, is now starting to break apart as well. The repression, the brutal repression the regime is using against innocent, peaceful, unarmed people in the streets is starting to also create fractures within the armed forces that do not want to violate the Constitution and to be also blamed for international crimes against humanity.
We've heard these rumors months ago that the military is showing cracks in their loyalty to President Maduro, yet we're still waiting for that to happen. What proof do you have that there is an overall willingness to see the military turn on its heels and abandon their long-standing loyalty to Maduro, who over the years has promoted many generals and fed their troops?
Not only that, we also realize that international crimes such as the cartels have been infiltrating the armed forces, and there's certainly many high-rank officials and military that are linked to these international mafia and that fear that with a regime change there will be justice and they will be blamed for that. But as days goes by, more and more soldiers and officials start denying and not accepting orders to attack innocent and peaceful demonstrators. There are more than 200 that are going through a judicial process because they have, as I mentioned, not accepted these orders, and there are hundreds that have asked the leave to go from the National Guard, which is a component that is being mainly used to repress citizens. But as I say, this is a process that is ongoing, and certainly the firm position of the national prosecutor, whom, as I said, used to be absolutely loyal to the process, and she has made a clear and definite decision to leave this process, has had a very important impact within the armed forces.
I want to get back to the protests, because you have been on the streets for the last several months leading these demonstrations against President Maduro. You insist, and others in the opposition insist, these are peaceful protests led by the people. They're non-violent. Yet we have seen violence. We've seen a man set on fire at an anti-government rally. We've most recently seen a judge who was responsible for the jailing of an opposition leader, Leopoldo Lopez, shot and killed. Your defense minister has said that he suspects it was the job of a hitman hired by the opposition. What do you respond to that accusation?
Look, everybody in Venezuela knows that violence comes from the regime, and that that's precisely what they want, to turn a non-violent movement, a citizen movement, in incidents such as this in order to justify the use of repression and force against us. Everybody in Venezuela that stands in front of the regime, journalists, even the church, have been blamed for these events, which clearly only benefit the regime. They have the arms. They are using these arms against innocent students, women, all people in the streets, and certainly the strength of our movement is the fact that it's non-violent, it's a civic movement, and that's how it will stay and grow every day that goes by.
Okay, but can you categorically deny there are no violent elements fighting your fight?
Look, you've seen it in images and videos throughout the world. Ours is a non-violent movement. If the regime infiltrates or mass movement with certain individuals that want to provoke or want to give an image that is contrary to our values, everybody knows who is behind it. At this point, the movement in Venezuela, nobody can stop it. They will not detain it. And it's precisely to fight against violence, impunity, and corruption, which is the essence of the regime in place right now. And the world should know what's going on in Venezuela. Every day that goes by, one young student, one woman is shot down by these repressive forces. But every day that goes by, also at least 70 Venezuelans die because of hunger, because of the collapse of the health system, and because of violent groups that operate with impunity for years in our country. So we need to stop this murder and the massacre of citizens that's taking place, and that will only start to happen when the regime realizes that their best option is to step aside and facilitate a transition to democracy and peace.
One of your colleagues in the opposition, Lilian Tintori, was recently in the Oval Office standing next to President Trump. An opposition former president, Alvaro Uribe in Colombia, has endorsed you personally, both very divisive figures from the right side of politics. President Maduro accuses the opposition of being sponsored by the U.S. and its Western friends. Does it help or hinder your cause if you have these types of friends backing you?
Look, we need every single democratic voice around the world backing the people of Venezuela. This has nothing to do with a right or left discussion. This has to do with human rights. This has to do with a society that is more united than ever to fight for its right to live with dignity, justice, peace, and freedom. And at this point, every single recognized human rights NGO, the European Parliament, and governments around the world, the OAS, has come out and speak out about the tragedy, the humanitarian crisis that's developing in Venezuela, and that could end in a catastrophe very soon if this is not stopped now. So every single voice that defends the right to our people to live in peace and freedom and democracy is needed and welcome at this point.
Mrs. Machado, we're going to have to leave it there. It was a pleasure speaking to you. Wish we had more time to speak, but many thanks for joining us.
That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Next time, we debate the terror attack on Iran's parliament. Has Daesh opened up another front? Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.